I came home after a grueling day at work, ready to unwind and maybe catch a quiet evening. The moment I stepped through the door, however, my wife's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. She was standing by the door, her coat already half on, looking frantic. "We have a very big problem," she announced, her tone somewhere between urgency and panic. Before I could even process what she meant by very big problem, she added, "It's so huge, I can't even describe it out loud," and started heading toward the door. I stopped in my tracks, confused. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my tone level despite the alarm bells going off in my head. She paused for the briefest moment, looked over her shoulder, and said, "I'm going to meet someone very important. They'll help fix this." That was all I got before she was out the door, moving so fast I barely had time to say another word. It was unusual for her to leave in such a rush, especially without explaining herself properly. We both worked at the same company, albeit in different departments, and while things could get hectic, this level of urgency was something else entirely. Left standing in the hallway, I tried to piece together what little information I had. What could be so critical that she couldn't wait to tell me? And who was this important person she needed to see? The lack of context was maddening, but I decided not to dwell too much on it. Maybe it was some work issue, something technical or managerial that didn't concern me directly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. Evening rolled around, and I heard her fumbling with the keys at the door. When she finally walked in, the smell of alcohol hit me before her words did. She was drunk, more so than I'd ever seen her in recent memory. She kicked off her shoes and stumbled into the living room, slurring, "I've got it. I figured it out." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if I should be relieved or more concerned. "Figured what out?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She flopped onto the couch, her head tipping back as she laughed. "The problem. The big one. It's not just my problem, it's yours too," she said, pointing a slightly unsteady finger in my direction. I waited for her to elaborate, but instead, she just grinned and added, "You'll like this solution. Trust me." That didn't exactly ease my worries. When I pressed her for details, she waved me off with a dismissive hand. "Not tonight. You'll find out tomorrow. We're going somewhere, and it'll all make sense then." And just like that, she face-planted into the nearest cushion, mumbling something incoherent before falling silent. I watched her for a moment, debating whether to push further, but she was already out cold. Resigned, I lifted her up and carried her to the bed, laying her down as gently as I could. She muttered something in her sleep, but it was impossible to make out. As I returned to the living room, my mind kept circling back to her words. What problem? What solution? And why did it involve me? The cryptic nature of it all gnawed at me. I decided to take a more direct approach. Picking up my phone, I scrolled through her contact list and sent a few messages to her close friends, hoping for some insight. "Do you know what's going on with her?" I asked them, keeping my tone casual enough not to raise any alarms. One by one, the replies came in, and each one said the same thing, nothing. "I don't know what you mean," one of them said. "She hasn't mentioned anything," said another. The uniform silence from her circle only deepened the mystery. By the time I put my phone down, I felt no closer to understanding what was happening. If anything, the lack of answers made things even more unsettling. Whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. And yet, I couldn't help but feel like I was being deliberately kept in the dark. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. The morning started abruptly when my wife shook me awake with an urgency I hadn't seen in a while. "Get up, we have to go." "Come on, hurry up," she said, already rummaging through the closet for something to wear. Still groggy, I rubbed my eyes and asked, "What's going on? Are you going to tell me what this is all about?" She shot back, "You'll find out soon enough. It's a problem of universal proportions." The way she said it left no room for argument, so I got dressed, trying not to grumble too much about being dragged into yet another mysterious situation. Once we were ready, she grabbed the car keys and announced, "I'm driving." I didn't argue. She seemed far too wound up to sit quietly in the passenger seat, and frankly, I didn't feel like fighting over something so trivial. As we pulled out of the driveway, I tried again to get some clarity. "Seriously, what's the deal?" She just glanced at me and said, "You'll see." That was the last word on the matter for the entire ride. We eventually pulled up to her friend's house, and it was immediately clear this wasn't just a casual visit. Cars were parked up and down the street, and the sound of voices carried from inside. When we walked through the door, the scene was almost overwhelming. A large group of people, mostly familiar faces from different departments of our company, were gathered in animated discussion. It was like an impromptu conference. My wife ushered me to a quieter corner, but before I could ask anything, the room quieted as someone stepped forward to address the group. "We have a serious problem," the speaker began, and the room collectively leaned in to listen. I exchanged a glance with my wife, wondering what on earth could warrant this level of secrecy and urgency. They went on to explain that the problem was related to organizing a secret corporate party. Apparently, the idea was to create something exclusive for select employees while leaving the rest of the office out of the loop. The more they talked, the more absurd it all sounded. Leaning closer to my wife, I muttered under my breath, "So this is what had you so worked up last night? You couldn't have just told me?" She whispered back, "Just wait and listen." I sighed, deciding to reserve my judgment until the full story unfolded. As the brainstorming session continued, one suggestion made my blood run cold. The deputy head of a department, a man I'd always found a bit off, chimed in. "Why not make it a swinger party? Throw in some intimate contests, keep it spicy," he said with a grin that made my skin crawl. What shocked me even more was that someone actually noted it down. I turned to my wife, incredulous. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. She just sighed and whispered, "Hold on, this isn't the main point." The conversation shifted to logistics, and it became clear that my wife, this deputy, and a few others were being put in charge of the whole thing. The group leader wrapped up the discussion with a toast, and alcohol began circulating. As people loosened up, the deputy sidled up to my wife, speaking in a low tone I couldn't quite catch. Suspicious, I stepped closer. "What's this about?" I asked. He just smirked and said, "Nothing you need to worry about. She'll know soon enough," and walked away. I turned to my wife, my patience wearing thin. This whole thing doesn't sit right with me. Especially that swinger party nonsense. "Have you all lost your minds?" She looked at me with a mix of frustration and resignation. "I'm not on board with it either," she said. "But I have to consider everyone's input. Don't worry, I'll make sure it doesn't happen." Her reassurance didn't do much to ease my concerns, but for now, it would have to do. She grabbed her coat and said, "Let's go home." We drove home in near silence, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest after the bizarre meeting. My wife seemed preoccupied, staring out of the window as if deep in thought. Once we got home, she disappeared into the kitchen while I sat down in the living room, still processing everything. Before I could even begin to unwind, her phone rang. She picked up quickly, her tone changing to something more formal. It didn't take long to figure out who was on the other end of the line. It was that guy from the meeting, the deputy head with his sleazy comments. Their conversation started casually but soon delved into details I couldn't quite make out. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and still, they kept talking. After about an hour, I finally had enough. "Can you wrap it up?" I asked, my voice firm. She held up a hand, gesturing for patience, and continued for another 10 minutes before finally ending the call. When she hung up, I didn't waste any time. "What could you possibly have to talk about for that long?" I asked. She shrugged, looking slightly annoyed. "It's just organizational stuff. We're meeting tomorrow after work to go over everything in detail." Her answer felt intentionally vague, so I pressed further. "What kind of details?" She sighed and said, "I don't know yet. He's planning something big. It's unusual for him to be this hands-on, so I'm curious myself." Her nonchalance irritated me. Big, like his brilliant idea to ruin the corporate party with a swinger theme? I shot back. She glared at me, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Stop talking nonsense," she snapped. "It's not like that." Her tone was sharp, but it didn't do much to reassure me. I decided to let it go, at least for now, but the whole thing still didn't sit right with me. She headed to bed shortly after, leaving me alone with my thoughts. This deputy head of hers was rubbing me the wrong way, and not just because of his crude comments during the meeting. He had a reputation for inappropriate jokes and behavior that always seemed to toe the line but never quite crossed it, at least, not publicly. It bothered me that my wife seemed so comfortable working with him, but I didn't want to come off as overly controlling. If it were up to me, she wouldn't be dealing with him at all. The fact that others from her team were also messaging her about this party didn't help. It wasn't just one suspicious person, it was a whole situation that felt off. But what could I do? If I insisted she step back, it would only create more tension between us. For now, all I could do was wait and see where this would lead. Something about the way she brushed off my concerns made me feel like I wasn't getting the full story. Whatever was brewing behind the scenes, I had a feeling it was going to get worse before it got better. And trust me, you won't believe what's coming next. The next day, I woke up to a quiet house. It was my day off, but my wife had work, so I had the place to myself. After a long stretch and a yawn, I got out of bed, planning to enjoy a lazy morning. Passing by the open wardrobe, something immediately caught my eye. There, among the neatly hung dresses, was a glaringly empty space where her short latex dress should have been. That dress was special, it wasn't something she wore out casually. It was meant for us, for private moments. My brows furrowed as I stared at the gap, a sense of irritation creeping in. Grabbing my phone, I called her, half expecting some kind of reasonable explanation. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk. "Hey, what's up?" she asked. "What are you wearing today?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. She hesitated for a split second before brushing me off. "I'm handling some important things right now. I'll tell you later." That wasn't the answer I was looking for. Hanging up, I couldn't shake the thought of that dress being used for anything other than what it was intended for. The whole situation rubbed me the wrong way. The rest of the day dragged on uneventfully. I tried to distract myself with a show, but my mind kept wandering back to the empty spot in the wardrobe. The dress had no business being anywhere but here, and her evasiveness only added to my unease. Every time I glanced at my phone, I debated calling her again but ultimately decided against it. The last thing I wanted was to start an argument over something that might have a simple explanation, though I wasn't holding my breath for one. Evening came, and I heard her key in the door. She walked in, looking tired but otherwise unbothered. I decided not to wait. "Where's the dress?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. She paused, looking slightly caught off guard, then replied, "Oh, that. A friend asked to borrow it." Her casual tone only fueled my irritation. "Which friend? And why?" I pressed. She waved her hand dismissively. "It's not a big deal." She needed it for something, and I said okay. That answer didn't sit well with me. "You could have told me," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. She shrugged, brushing past me toward the kitchen. "It's just a dress." "Don't make it into a thing," she said. But it wasn't just a dress, not to me. The fact that she hadn't even mentioned it until I confronted her made it feel like she was deliberately hiding something. Still, I let it drop for the moment, deciding to see if she'd offer any more details on her own. Later that evening, as we sat together, I tried steering the conversation back to her day. "So, what's going on with this party planning?" I asked. She sighed, looking genuinely weary. "There's just so much to deal with. This was just one meeting, there's going to be more. Honestly, I'm so over it." Her tone had a sharp edge to it, and I could tell she didn't want to talk about it any further. "Well, what exactly did you talk about today?" I asked, refusing to let it go. She gave me a vague answer about logistics and ideas being thrown around but didn't elaborate. When I pushed for specifics, she just shook her head. It's too much to explain. Let's just say it's not the first meeting and definitely won't be the last. That didn't exactly inspire confidence. As the night wound down, she dropped one last piece of information that caught me off guard. "Oh, by the way," she said, almost as an afterthought. "That deputy head? He has something for you. A gift, apparently. I'm supposed to give it to you tomorrow." Her tone was casual, but the word sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way she said it didn't feel right. What kind of gift could this guy possibly have for me? Whatever it was, I had a feeling it wasn't going to be something I'd like. The day started like any other as I headed to work, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering in the back of my mind. By now, the situation with my wife and her involvement in this party planning was starting to feel less like a nuisance and more like a growing concern. At work, I ran into the deputy head of her department a couple of times. Each time, he gave me this smirk that only added to my suspicions. "Hope you'll like what's coming," he said at one point. "I give it to you now, but it's not ready yet." I nodded, keeping my response brief. "Thanks." Inwardly, I couldn't help but think there was something off about the whole thing. Later, as I was leaving for the day, I saw my wife standing outside the building, deep in conversation with the same guy. My stomach tightened, but I kept my composure as I walked over. "What's going on?" I asked, inserting myself into the conversation. They both looked up, and my wife answered quickly. "We're just going over some of the details for the party. Nothing major." The deputy head chimed in with a chuckle, "Just some organizational stuff. Don't worry about it." I didn't like his tone, but I decided not to push it there and then. As we drove home, my wife mentioned she'd be home earlier than usual tonight. "It's just a quick meeting with the guys," she said. I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. The more she tried to downplay everything, the more it felt like there was something she wasn't telling me. I dropped her off and went about my day, trying to shake off the nagging doubts. That evening, she arrived home earlier than I expected. After a quick hello, she headed straight for the shower. "Can you unpack my bag for me?" she called from the bathroom. I hesitated for a moment before going to grab her bag. As I unzipped it, a long, slim box caught my attention. Curious, I opened it and found a folded note on top. My blood ran cold as I read it. It was a love letter, explicit and detailed, describing all the things this person wanted to do with my wife. My hands clenched into fists as I stared at the note, anger bubbling just below the surface. When she came out of the bathroom, I didn't waste a second. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, holding up the note. Her face shifted from confusion to shock. "I have no idea," she said. "Maybe someone put it there as a joke or something." Her explanation sounded weak, and I wasn't buying it. "If you think I'm involved with that guy, check the handwriting," she added, clearly frustrated. Reluctantly, I compared the note to something I'd seen from him before. She was right, the handwriting didn't match. "Maybe it's someone else from my team," she suggested. "There's a guy who's leaving soon. Could be his way of making an impression before he goes." The explanation didn't completely satisfy me, but it at least gave me something to consider. Still uneasy, I decided to move on and focus on the other item in the bag, the box itself. Inside was a bottle of expensive alcohol, along with another note. This one was from the deputy head, and it read, "A little something to get you in the mood for the big event." My wife glanced over and shrugged. "Oh, that. He's been giving those out to everyone involved. Just a party favor, nothing more." Her casual demeanor grated on me, but I let it slide for now. At least this time, her explanation made some sense. As the evening wore on, she seemed to relax, even laughing a little as we talked about unrelated things. Before heading to bed, she mentioned one last thing. "Oh, by the way, I'm meeting with my friend tomorrow to discuss a few more things. Just a quick get-together to sort out the final details." I nodded, though the pit in my stomach didn't go away. Okay, I said. I'd play along for now, but the pieces were adding up, and I didn't like the picture they were starting to form. After a long day at work, I finally got home, hoping for some peace and quiet. My wife, as usual, was running late. I settled into my chair, deciding to kill some time by checking my emails on the laptop. As I opened the browser, I noticed a series of recent search queries that immediately caught my attention. The searches were related to adult-themed party ideas, far from the kind of thing I'd expect to see. I sat there, staring at the screen, my thoughts racing. Whatever was going on, it was clear my wife and I were due for a serious conversation. A little while later, I heard the front door open. She walked in, not alone, but with one of her friends. My frustration spiked. I hated dealing with personal matters in front of others, and her timing couldn't have been worse. They made their way to the living room, chatting animatedly. I stayed quiet, waiting for a chance to bring up what I'd found. As they talked, their conversation shifted to increasingly personal topics. They laughed about relationships, shared stories about her friend's boyfriend, and then, to my growing annoyance, started discussing details about the upcoming party. The program is amazing, my wife said, practically glowing. I'm going to be exhausted, but so happy when it's over. I couldn't hold back any longer. What exactly is so exciting about this party? I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. Her friend chimed in before she could answer. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. It's tomorrow, after all, she said with a wink. That only made things worse. Tomorrow? I asked. You're cutting it awfully close for something that's not fully prepared. They both shrugged, dismissing my concern. We have the whole night to finalize everything, her friend said casually. The evening dragged on, and when her friend finally left, I decided it was time to address what I'd found. So, what's up with those browser searches? I asked, not bothering to sugarcoat it. She looked at me with mild irritation. Oh, that? It's nothing. Just a random article I came across while brainstorming ideas, she said, waving it off like it wasn't a big deal. I wasn't convinced. Listen, I said, I appreciate that you're trying to make this party great, but this is all starting to seem a little strange. The late nights, the secrecy. Are you hiding something from me? That struck a nerve. Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. You know what? I'm sick of this, she snapped. I'm juggling a million things to make this event happen, and instead of supporting me, you're here accusing me of who knows what. Her voice rose as she continued. If it bothers you so much, maybe I should just stay home and celebrate with you instead, she said sarcastically. I took a deep breath, realizing I'd pushed too far. You know what? Fine, I said. That's better than you being there and me worrying the whole time. I'm sorry for accusing you. I'll make sure we have a great day together. She seemed to calm down at that, and we headed to bed, both of us ready to leave the argument behind. The day started off uneventfully as my wife and I prepared to leave for work. We walked out together, but just as we were about to head to the car, the deputy head of her department stopped us. He directed his question solely at her. So, everything is still on for the corporate event, he asked, his tone casual but with an undertone that set me on edge. My wife responded quickly, actually, we've decided to celebrate separately. He smiled faintly, almost mockingly. What a shame. You'll be missing out on all the fun, he said. But at least enjoy the gift. Good luck. His words felt loaded, but I couldn't quite place why. I nodded curtly and guided my wife toward the car. She didn't seem fazed by his comment, but it stuck with me all the way home. Once we arrived, we decided to focus on getting things ready for our quiet evening. We spent the next hour or so preparing snacks and drinks, chatting lightly about unrelated topics. It felt nice to have a break from all the tension surrounding the party. Eventually, I opened the bottle of cognac the deputy had given us. Before taking a sip, I made a point of downing some activated charcoal pills, just in case. I wasn't about to let my guard down completely. As I poured myself a glass, I noticed my wife wasn't drinking. "I'll skip it tonight," she said casually. That caught me off guard. She rarely passed on a drink, especially during a relaxed evening like this. I sipped cautiously, but before long, I started feeling a little off. My head felt heavy, and my eyelids drooped. "I think I need to lie down," I told her, my voice slower than usual. "I'm feeling a bit dizzy." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Go ahead. Lie down and put on a movie. I'll finish cleaning up and join you soon," she said. I barely made it to the couch before I passed out. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by the shrill ring of my phone. Disoriented, I grabbed it, seeing my colleague's name on the screen. "Hey," I mumbled, still groggy. His voice was urgent. "We need to talk." "It's serious," he said. In the background, I could hear loud music. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to shake off the fog. "Are you at home with your wife?" he asked. "Yeah, she's here," I replied, glancing around the empty living room. "No, she's not," he said firmly. "She's here at the other office, and you're not going to like what she's doing." My blood ran cold as he continued. "Look, man, she's been working in a completely different role than what she's told you. Let's just say it's not exactly professional. If you want the full picture, come to this address." He rattled it off, and I quickly jotted it down. I sat there for a moment, letting his words sink in. She'd lied to me, not just about tonight but about her job itself. My heart pounded as anger surged through me. Was this the reason for all the secrecy and late nights? Had she really been hiding this from me the entire time? I clenched my jaw and grabbed my keys. "I'll be there," I said, my voice hard with resolve. Hanging up, I stormed out of the house, determination and fury driving me straight to the address he'd given. I arrived at the office address my colleague had given me, my mind racing and my fists clenched. The building was quiet except for faint sounds filtering through the upper floors. My stomach churned as I climbed the stairs, each step heavy with anticipation. The strange noises grew louder, more distinct, as I neared the source. I braced myself, pushing the door open, and what I saw froze me in place. There, in the middle of the room, was my wife, covered in some white substance, betraying me with 3 other men. I didn't make a sound. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, pulling out my phone. I began recording, capturing everything without a word. My eyes darted around the room, and I noticed other familiar faces. Among them were some of her married friends, equally engaged in the debauchery. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I didn't linger. Once I had enough footage, I slipped out of the room, my blood boiling. Outside, I paced for a moment before calling the husbands of the women I'd just seen. One by one, I told them to come to the office immediately. "You need to see this for yourself," I said. There was no way to soften the blow, and frankly, I didn't care to. The betrayal I felt was all-consuming, and I knew they deserved to know the truth as much as I did. After making the calls, I waited, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the men arrived, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. I led them inside, back up the stairs, and into the room where everything was unfolding. The door swung open, and their expressions quickly turned to shock and rage. "What the hell is going on here?" one of them shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The guilty parties froze, their faces a mixture of surprise and fear as we stormed in. Chaos erupted almost immediately. One of the husbands lunged at a man, fists flying, and it wasn't long before the rest of us joined in. My focus was laser-sharp as I targeted the men my wife had been with. Every punch was fueled by the betrayal I felt, every hit an outlet for the anger that had been building for weeks. The deputy head tried to intervene, stepping forward with his hands raised. "Calm down, everyone," he said. "Maybe you should join us instead?" His smug grin was the last straw, and I was the first to land a punch squarely on his face. The room devolved into utter chaos as we fought to restore some semblance of dignity, if only for ourselves. Eventually, the fight subsided, and we began gathering our wives, pulling them away from the scene. My wife protested as I dragged her toward the exit. "What the hell are you doing?" she yelled. "You're ruining everything." Her words only fueled my anger. "Get in the car," I snapped, refusing to engage further. As we drove home, she didn't stop. "You're so boring," she spat. "You've ruined all the fun because you can't handle a little excitement." I gripped the wheel tightly, biting back the words I wanted to say. The betrayal was bad enough, hearing her blame me for her actions was almost too much to bear. I kept my focus on the road, determined to get her home and end the night without another word. The other husbands had similar experiences, their wives equally defiant or tearful as they were taken away. It was a bitter ride back, each of us lost in our thoughts. For me, the realization was sinking in, this wasn't just a bad night or a single mistake. It was a betrayal on a level I couldn't forgive, and the fallout was only just beginning. The drive home was silent except for my wife's occasional huffs of indignation. I could feel my anger simmering, threatening to boil over at any moment. As soon as we got inside the house, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Give me your phone," I demanded, my voice like steel. She glared at me, defiant as ever. "No," she snapped, throwing her phone to the floor. It hit with a crack, the screen shattering, but I didn't care. I picked it up, knowing full well that no amount of damage to the exterior would stop me from accessing what I needed. Her expression shifted instantly. Gone was the defiance, replaced by panic. "Please," she begged, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Don't look at it. It's not what you think." Her voice cracked, and she reached for my arm, but I pulled away. "You don't get to tell me what to do right now," I said coldly. Ignoring her sobs, I powered on the phone. The first thing I opened was the chat labeled corporate party. What I saw was worse than anything I could have imagined. The messages were explicit, detailing every aspect of the swinger party. Plans, partners, even roles, it was all there. My wife's name was mentioned repeatedly, and so were her friends. The group chat was filled with videos and pictures, including ones from the event tonight. I scrolled through them, my hands shaking with rage. The images left no room for doubt. She and her friends had been fully involved in every aspect of the debauchery, their betrayal laid bare for anyone to see. As if that wasn't enough, I moved to her private messages. The thread with the deputy head of her department caught my eye immediately. My stomach turned as I read through the messages. He'd been coordinating with her for weeks, if not months. The most damning part was the plan he'd laid out in chilling detail. He drugged the alcohol at our home, intending to knock me out so my wife could attend the party without interference. The fact that he had gone to such lengths made my blood boil. "So this is what you've been up to?" I said, holding up the phone. She collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. "I didn't want to go, but they pressured me. I didn't have a choice." Her excuses only fueled my fury. "You didn't have a choice?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You had every choice, and you made the wrong one every single time." She tried to grab the phone, but I stepped back. "You've lied to me for months," I said. "You betrayed me in every way possible, and now you want me to believe you're the victim? Don't insult my intelligence." She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," she begged, "don't do this. I'll fix everything. Just don't throw it all away." But her words rang hollow. There was nothing left to fix. I turned and walked to our bedroom, pulling out her suitcase. One by one, I packed her belongings, ignoring her cries and pleas. Every piece of clothing, every personal item, went into the bag with methodical precision. When I was done, I zipped it up and carried it back to the living room. "Get up," I said. She looked up at me, her face red and tear-streaked. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're leaving," I said simply. I grabbed her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make it clear I wasn't giving her a choice. She struggled briefly, but the fight in her was gone. I opened the door and guided her outside, placing her suitcase on the porch. "Don't come back," I said. "We're done." The door closed with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally in control. The night was far from over as I sat in the quiet of the house, my anger still simmering. The phone in my hand felt heavy with the weight of what I'd uncovered. My wife's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was part of a larger web of deceit that involved several others. I opened the chat containing videos from the party and carefully forwarded the most incriminating ones to the husbands I'd called earlier. "Here's your proof," I wrote. "This should help you in court." One by one, they acknowledged receipt, their responses ranging from stunned silence to outright rage. As I sent the messages, a loud knock sounded at the door. I didn't need to look to know who it was. My wife's voice came through, muffled but pleading. "Let me in," she cried. "We need to talk." I ignored her, focusing instead on what was unfolding in front of me. The pounding continued, but eventually, it grew weaker before stopping altogether. A glance out the window confirmed that she'd finally left, though the sight of her standing in the cold didn't stir any sympathy in me. Returning to the phone, I began sifting through more messages, determined to see the full extent of what had been going on. That's when I stumbled upon a conversation between her and the deputy head. It wasn't just damning, it was a blueprint for everything they'd orchestrated. Among the messages was a chilling revelation: they knew if their actions came to light, the company's higher-ups would fire everyone involved. "We need to keep this between us," one message read. "If the boss finds out, it's over for all of us." The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about their betrayal, it was about their blatant disregard for everything and everyone around them. The conversation made it clear they had no remorse, only fear of getting caught. That fear was about to become a reality. I scrolled through the chat, capturing screenshots of every incriminating detail. The deputy's smug messages, the plans to spike drinks, the admissions of guilt, it was all there. Once I'd compiled everything, I took a deep breath and composed a message to the company's top executive. "You need to see this," I wrote, attaching the evidence. "It's not just about the party. This is what's been happening under your roof." I hesitated for only a moment before hitting send. There was no turning back now. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, waiting for a response. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered, and the voice on the other end introduced itself as the company's CEO. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said, his tone calm but firm. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and it's clear we need to take swift action." I listened as he outlined his plan. Half of the department, including the deputy head and everyone else involved, would be terminated immediately. The severity of their actions left no room for leniency. As for me, he expressed his gratitude for exposing the truth. "You've done us a great service," he said. "Take some time off. Consider it a thank you for your honesty and courage." Hanging up, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. The fallout was just beginning, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of closure. They would face the consequences of their actions, and I'd ensured that justice was served. The house was quiet again, save for the occasional buzz of my phone as messages from the other husbands continued to pour in. For now, I could finally breathe. The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly, pulling me from the first decent sleep I'd had in days. It was her. Against my better judgment, I answered. The moment I said hello, she launched into a tirade. "You're the worst person I've ever known," she shouted. "Do you have any idea how many people lost their jobs because of you?" Her voice was full of venom, but all I felt was cold detachment. I let her finish before responding calmly, "That's exactly what I wanted. Let them find other places for their lies and betrayal." My words seemed to strike a nerve because she hung up without another word. I set the phone down, not letting her outburst shake me. Instead, I dialed my lawyer. "I need to file for divorce," I said without hesitation. The lawyer asked a few questions about the situation, and I explained everything briefly but clearly. He assured me he'd start the paperwork immediately. As soon as the call ended, I moved to the next task, securing my home. I changed every lock, knowing full well that she might try to come back. This was my space now, and I wouldn't allow her to disrupt it further. With her gone, I began to assess the situation more practically. She'd left with nothing but the clothes on her back, and everything else, from her car to her belongings, was still under my roof. Legally, it all belonged to me. The house was in my name, as was her car, and it wasn't some devious plan on my part. She'd never bothered with paperwork or details, always trusting me to handle it. At the time, I thought it was just her way of simplifying things. Now, it felt like a safeguard I hadn't realized I'd needed. Some might call me mercenary for holding onto her assets, but I saw it differently. She'd shown no regard for our marriage, so why should I make things easier for her now? The car was the first thing I dealt with. It sat in the driveway, a constant reminder of her presence. I contacted a buyer I knew and arranged for a quick sale. Within days, the car was gone, and the cash was in my account. It felt like a small but significant step toward moving on. The rest of her belongings were another story. Boxes of clothes, trinkets, and personal items cluttered the spare room. I considered having them sent to her, but the idea of going out of my way for her felt laughable. Instead, I decided they could stay right where they were until she figured out how to retrieve them herself. It wasn't my problem anymore, and I wasn't about to make it one. My own car, a prized possession I'd worked hard for, was another matter. I wasn't taking any chances with it. I moved it into the garage, locking it securely and double-checking that the security cameras were working. She'd lost the right to touch anything of mine, and I wasn't about to let her take advantage of my trust again. Looking around the house, I felt a strange mix of emptiness and relief. The silence was heavy, but it was preferable to the chaos she'd brought into my life. I knew this was only the beginning of the changes I needed to make, but it was a start. Selling her car and securing my own felt like reclaiming control, a step toward building a new life without her. By the end of the week, her car was a distant memory, and mine was safely locked away. I'd taken the first steps to distance myself from her and everything she represented. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. The divorce proceedings began like a storm on the horizon, with my wife arriving at the court, guns blazing. She painted herself as the victim, claiming I was a cruel man who had thrown her out of the house without a second thought. She called me an abuser, accusing me of stealing her car and leaving her with nothing. Her arguments were dramatic, but they lacked substance. Every word she spoke only served to highlight how far she was willing to go to shift the blame. She didn't stop there. She tried to sway the court by accusing me of ruining her life and the careers of others. "He destroyed half the office," she wailed. All because of his jealousy and paranoia. Her attempts to twist the narrative were almost laughable. I stayed silent, letting her dig herself deeper with every exaggerated claim. When my lawyer finally stood up, the real evidence came to light. We presented everything, the videos, the messages, and the documents. It was all irrefutable. The court saw the group chat detailing the swinger party, the explicit plans, and even the admissions of drugging me. The messages from the deputy head and my wife's own words sealed her fate. On top of that, every piece of property, including the house and car, was legally mine. The judge's expression grew sterner with every piece of evidence we submitted. My lawyer dismantled her accusations with ease, pointing out the inconsistencies in her story and the overwhelming evidence against her. When she claimed I had taken everything from her unfairly, he simply handed over the paperwork showing that every asset had always been in my name. By the end of the hearing, it was clear to everyone in the room that her case had no merit. She'd walked in expecting sympathy but left with nothing. The court ruled entirely in my favor. She was left with no claim to the house, the car, or any other assets. But it didn't end there. My lawyer had also filed a separate case against her and the deputy head for spiking my drink. The evidence was ironclad, and the court ordered both of them to pay a substantial amount in damages. Her humiliation was complete, and she was left with no choice but to move back in with her mother and start over from scratch. Watching her struggle to come to terms with the consequences of her actions gave me a sense of closure. She'd spent so much time trying to manipulate and deceive, only to find herself completely exposed. Meanwhile, the deputy head faced his own share of fallout. The damage to his reputation and finances was irreversible. It was poetic justice, and I couldn't have asked for a better outcome. With the legal battles behind me, I finally had the space to breathe and reflect on everything that had happened. Friends and colleagues reached out, some offering support and others seeking details about the scandal. I kept my responses measured, focusing on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. The chaos had been exhausting, but it had also been a necessary reckoning. In the end, I found peace in knowing that justice had been served. When people asked me how I felt about everything, I gave them the same answer: I did what needed to be done. When someone betrays your trust, you don't let it slide. You set boundaries and protect what's yours. That's exactly what I did, and I have no regrets.